Today is Monday. It's August the 23rd. My joy to come to you today with our devotional titled, God is Just, He Rewards Faithfulness. Now, our scripture reading is 1 Chronicles chapter 14 and chapter 15. If you're following the 2-year reading schedule that we published earlier in the year in January, you'll notice that I'm actually combining 2 chapters, 1 Chronicles 14, and taking tomorrow's devotional reading and making it today. So 1 Chronicles 14, 15 is today's devotional reading. Now, 1 Chronicles 14, I've subtitled it, The Lord Blessed David's Reign. Now, David having conquered and claimed Jerusalem as his capital city, it follows that David should build a palace in that historic city that would reflect his reign as king. Now, the names of David's sons that were born in Jerusalem are found in verses 3 through 7. As we notice in 2 Samuel chapter 5, the Philistines were the first to test David as the king of a united Israel, and they were soundly defeated. However, just as important as the battles was David's preparation for them. Allow me to illustrate. As you look at 1 Chronicles 14, look at verse 14, where we read, David inquired of God, saying, Shall I go up against the Philistines? Wilt thou deliver them into mine hand? And the Lord said unto David, Go up, for I will deliver them, the Philistines, into thy hand. For the second battle, we read again in verse 14, David inquired again of God. Now it's interesting. The strategy for the second battle was different than that of the first battle by the Lord's directions. David did not question the Lord. He obeyed the Lord. He sought the Lord's will. And guess what? Verse 16, God gave David the victory. More than the victories, though, was the fact that David had become an international figure in the ancient world. We read in 1 Chronicles 14 and verse 17, the fame of David went out into all lands, and the Lord brought the fear of him upon all nations. And so here we have this small nation, and yet under the hand of David as king, but under the mighty hand of God's blessing, David and Israel began to step onto the international stage. Now, 1 Chronicles 15 is a moment of historic relevance, for the Ark of God is brought to Jerusalem. Now, you might remember 1 Chronicles chapter 13, 9 through 10, David's first attempt to bring the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem had ended in tragedy. Failing to consult the method or the means of transporting the ark had cost Uzzah his life. Displeased, angry, frustrated, David complained to the Lord in verse 12 of 1 Chronicles 13, How shall I bring the ark to God home to me? Well, David's second attempt to bring the ark to Jerusalem was a success, and he had not only learned from his failure, but this time he had sought the mind and the will of God. And therefore he commanded the Levites to bring the ark to his capital. We read in chapter 15 and verse 13 of 1 Chronicles that the king confessed, For because ye, speaking to the Levites, did it not at the first, the Lord our God made a breach. He suddenly judged us, for that we sought him not after the due order. Wow, what a striking thought. The failure to seek God's will invited God's judgment. Now, 1 Chronicles 15 and verse 14 and 15, rather than a cart, David commanded the Levites to bear the ark upon their shoulders using gold gilded staves, that is, poles, to carry it, as we read in verse 15, as Moses commanded according to the word of the Lord. Now, verses 4 through 11 gives us an important register of Levite families that were those whom God had chosen to serve him on behalf of his people and to serve the nation and lead them in worship. I especially invite you to notice 1 Chronicles 15 and verse 16 through 24, the important role of singers and musicians in worship. Now, there are various classes of musicians that are named in those verses, including the principal composers who are named in verse 17. Now, continuing verses 19 through 24, the musicians were all from the tribe of Levi. Now, the Lord had set them apart to serve him. And there were some who were not only skilled in singing, but also skilled in various instruments that were employed in worship. What were those instruments? Cymbals of brass, psalteries, that is a lute, harps, trumpets, all accompanied the choir that lifted their voices and singing the psalms. In the midst were also, verses 23 and 24, doorkeepers. Who were those doorkeepers? They were actually the guards. They were the gatekeepers. Now, our study of 1 Chronicles 15 concludes with a national celebration that greeted the arrival of the ark in Jerusalem. You're going to find in verse 27 of 1 Chronicles 15 that David himself took upon himself the dress of the Levites, a robe of linen. So taking off the royal robes, he placed upon himself the ephod of linen. And the ark arrived at the capital. The joy, the celebration, David was ecstatic with joy. 1 Chronicles 15, however, concludes tragically with a foreboding of sorrow. David's first wife, Michal, the daughter of Saul, looking out a window, saw David dancing and playing, and she despised, had contempt for him in her heart. Now, you have to go to 2 Samuel chapter 6, 15 through 19, to see the parallel passage that amplifies Michal's spirit toward her husband, the king. Consider this then. At the end of that day of celebration, the arrival of the Ark of the Covenant in Jerusalem, David walks into the palace. He's still wearing the linen robe like that of the Levites. His heart is filled with joy. But rather than delight in her husband's triumph, Michal, the daughter of Saul, despised and condemned him. David answered her contempt and unashamedly identified himself as the man whom God had chosen to rule his people. You know, as I look back over my years of ministry, some 44 years now, I cannot remember a time that a moment of rejoicing wasn't threatened by an adversary. And I want to caution you, there will always be someone who is ready to dampen your enthusiasm to serve the Lord and steal your joy. Now I challenge you, when those times occur, and they will, remember that God is just. He rewards faithfulness, and He will punish sin. And by the way, what became of Michal, the first wife of David, the daughter of Saul? What becomes of her after she has such contempt for her husband, the king? Well, we find the answer to that in 2 Samuel chapter 6 and verse 23. Michal was condemned to go to her grave childless. For we read in verse 23 of 2 Samuel 6, for she had no child unto the day of her death. Listen, you're going to have adversaries. You're going to have those who will attack you. When you are serving and rejoicing in the Lord, remember this: God is faithful. He will reward your faithfulness. In the end, your adversaries who desire to discourage you, they will suffer His judgment. God bless you, and bye-bye.